Meghan Markle is accused of impersonating Diana, the police are gathering evidence on Andrew, and the King's Trust International celebrates its 10-year anniversary. I'm Jack Royston, Newsweek's chief royal correspondent, and this is Newsweek's Royal Report. Hello listeners and welcome to the show. Now, Meghan Markle has done a major sit-down interview with Harper's Bazaar in which she talked about authenticity, obviously huge buzzword at the moment, especially with young people. And it ties in, interestingly, with a report that they've done. But the bizarre thing about it is, so she did this whole interview, beautiful photos, the outfits looked amazing, and then obviously it descended into a huge kind of bin fire on social media quite quickly because Meghan was accused of impersonating Princess Diana in some of these photographs. Now, one thing that's interesting about that is that at its core is an allegation of inauthenticity. So she wasn't accused of paying tribute to Princess Diana, where it was kind of like an explicit tribute wearing a piece of her jewellery or something like that. She was accused of kind of secretly recreating past photos from Princess Diana's kind of deep archive. And also there were some other kind of really bizarre moments to the interview which were kind of very sort of like 1% energy, you know, like it came across as really sort of slightly elite. I think the funniest, because it's genuinely is quite funny, some parts of it. And one of them, she's got this journalist from Harper's Bazaar, she's kind of taking her around, she takes her to this event where there are some young girls who get a chance to meet Meghan, and it's all kind of, I suppose, supposed to be like part of the giving back phase, but then she takes her to this New York house where Meghan's staying, and the house manager there announces Meghan's arrival to an empty room. Basically, there's nobody in the house, it's deserted, and this is what the journalist Caitlin Greenidge wrote. She wrote, "We're in a grand brownstone on the Upper East Side that belongs to one of Meghan's friends. When I enter, the house manager announces Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, even though we appear to be the only other two people in the house." And then there was another meeting. They met at the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And so Meghan kind of, you know, they had a whole meal. And at the end of the meal, the staff brought this kind of free cappuccino to Meghan, which had a photo of Meghan printed in the foam. So you know how sometimes like when you go to the coffee shop, you get like a little heart shape in the foam on your latte. It's kind of like that, except it was a photorealistic image of Meghan's face. So I think this is something you can do now. You can buy like printers that print into the foam. So no doubt they just like they realised who Meghan was, got a photo off the internet and just got the machine to do it. But this is what Greenidge wrote about it. "Our allotted time at the table is coming to a close. The last of the meal is whisked away and a waiter comes by with an unsolicited cappuccino. In the foam on top, the restaurant has printed a photorealistic image of Meghan. Oh, she says, smiling down at it, I recognise this picture. It's from our trip to South Africa. It's a lovely and absurd perk of celebrity, and Meghan is tickled enough to take a photo of it." So this is not the sort of thing you really want to happen when you're giving an interview about the importance of authenticity. And it's tempting to think that Meghan threw those references to authenticity into the interview kind of on a whim, but it can't really have been because just after the interview was published, they put on their website this report about, you know, how they've been doing basically effectively market research with young people across the world in America, Canada, Britain and other places. And the big, you know, take home from it, the big buzzword to come out of it is that young people are sick of the inauthenticity of the influencers they follow and they expect authenticity from real leaders. So it's obviously is where they're now pitching themselves. So, this is what Meghan said about it in the Harper's Bazaar interview. She was talking about having gone to the Balenciaga show at Paris Fashion Week, which also kicked up a big stink, and also about Diana, because people thought that she had kind of deliberately filmed herself driving past a bridge near to where Diana died with her feet up. And so some people kind of took exception to that, which I thought was a bit tough on Meghan, to be totally honest, but there we are. So Meghan was talking about how she went to this Balenciaga show at Paris Fashion Week, and she said, I love being able to do both, to play in the sandbox with my kids and to play in the front row at a show. I think the moment you start making all of your personal decisions based on external judgment, then you lose your authenticity. So she's basically doing the classic thing that Harry and Meghan do sometimes, which is when they want to land a point with people, they just go out and simply tell that's what's happening. I am authentic, rather than kind of trying to display or show authenticity, which is, it's a real problem because people hate being told what to think. It's show, don't tell. You have to show people what you want them to believe, because people hate being told what to think. And this is actually something that the Queen did brilliantly, Queen Elizabeth II. She knew how to kind of create a moment of theatre in which she could perform the message she wanted people to have, whether it was, abiding by COVID restrictions during Prince Philip's funeral, or just all the sacrifices that she made during her long royal career. She was very good at kind of showing people the message rather than telling them. But the real sting in the tail, of course, for Meghan, is less the kind of humour about the bizarre bits of the interview, but really it's this stuff about Diana, these allegations that the pictures were kind of carbon copies of photos from Diana's archives. It goes back to a Vogue magazine shoot that Diana did in 1994, and there's 2 images from it, one of which didn't come out until actually after Diana died, and it's her it's a black and white photo, and it's her in black trousers with a white top, and she's sitting kind of cross-legged but with her knees kind of high in the air and her elbows on her knees, so it's creating these kind of angular triangles between her arms meeting her knees and her legs then going down to the floor, and she kind of looks very like relaxed and at ease in herself. And then the other one is it was Diana in a red dress, and I think that was the actual cover image from the Vogue shoot, I think, and they were both by the same French fashion photographer. So, part of me does feel a little bit sorry for Meghan, because obviously we don't know where that artistic direction came from. It could well be that it came from the stylist, because we know that Meghan had a stylist, and that, she was dressed by someone. The photographer will have had their input too. There are behind the scenes like video clips from the shoot, and there's like just this whole sea, there's a clothing rail with like outfit after outfit after outfit. So who knows exactly how they chose and put together each particular outfit. Obviously, it's hypothetically possible. Meghan could have come along with some old photos of Diana and said, right, I love this picture, I want to recreate it. That's possible. It's equally possible that the stylist did some research before the shoot, didn't the first time probably working with royalty, and wanted to look back through the kind of archives to see what has been done in the past and what worked well. So we don't know where the artistic direction came from, but obviously part of the reason why Meghan is being hit over the head with this particular stick is because she has been building for years. It's because of all the other things that have been said about Diana in the past. And there's this feeling, I think, among detractors of Harry and Meghan that they have overused and over-leveraged Diana's memory. So William did talk about Diana a lot, actually, back in 2017 when it was the 20th anniversary of her death, and William and Harry together did these big documentaries about it. But William told a bunch of us journalists who were reporting on it at the time, there was like a kind of press conference, and he got us all together. I was there as well, and he said that this was a one-time thing and he wasn't going to do it again. It was the 20th anniversary of Diana's death. This was their moment when they were going to talk about her, pay tribute to her, discuss her life and her death and the impact that it had on them, and then the box was going to close and he wasn't going to go back to it. Whereas Harry and Meghan have taken a slightly different approach. They have talked about Diana a lot, and Harry has, talked a lot about saying that, he sees history repeating itself in the way that the media treated Meghan, and so he's kind of politicised that memory too. But he's also talked about his own kind of battle with what he calls the establishment, an establishment stitch-up, when he's been trying to get his police protection detail reinstated, and saying, that mirrors Princess Diana's story. And I think people are perhaps more understanding about it when Harry talks about it, because, Diana's his mother, and it must have absolutely devastated him when she died. But there is a huge amount of skepticism floating around about Meghan using Diana's memory and trying to leverage, Diana's fame and Diana's popularity in order. There's an idea that she's trying to, further her own cause and her own gain using Diana's memory. And so a kind of malign secret intent is inferred into Meghan's actions. Now, Meghan gets criticised on social media all the time. So her getting criticised is absolutely nothing new. But the amount of interaction that some of these posts were getting in the millions is something that should kind of be a warning sign to Meghan that this is becoming a bit of a difficult subject. And in fairness, there have been some times in the past when, it has been very uncomfortable, the way that Meghan has acted about Diana. I think the bit that I found most kind of difficult was a passage from Harry's book Spare, where he talks about taking Meghan out to see Diana's grave for the first time. So Diana's grave is on an island at her family's estate in Northamptonshire, and that's precisely because they didn't want there to be a big public grave where everybody would be able to kind of like constantly turn into a shrine and appropriate, I suppose. And so, you have to sail out on a little rowing boat in order to get to Diana's grave. And so Harry kind of left her there because he sensed that she needed a moment. And then he got back and she was crouched on the floor with her palms pressed to the surface of the gravestone. Harry asked her what she was doing, and she said she was seeking clarity and guidance. And that struck me as slightly too much for a woman you've never met. It just struck me as like a little over the top to feel like you are kind of in communion with because Diana isn't just Harry's mother, like she's William's mother too, and Charles's ex-wife. And if I was in William or Charles's position, I would genuinely find that extremely uncomfortable, I think. So I do think that there are times when, they come across a little bit too much in relation to Diana, and that is part of why this whole idea is gathering steam. So that I think is a big part of why it's a lightning rod and why it's getting the level of attention it's getting on social media. But also, there's the wider Harry and Meghan inauthenticity crisis. So before I get too far into that, I do actually want to read some passage of this report they've released. So they, like I said, they spoke to about 100 odd kids from around the world and just asked them what they wanted from leaders. And the big thing to come out of it is about authenticity. And so the report says, across every geography, young people distinguished between influencers and true leaders. Influencers, they explained, were performative, inauthentic, and profit-motivated. Real leadership requires authenticity, commitment to causes over profit, and tangible impact beyond follower counts. So that is all really, really important for understanding what's going on with Harry and Meghan at the moment, because obviously how Harry and Meghan got into this current situation where people do read Meghan in particular as inauthentic, Harry less so, but people see her that way. A big part of it is because they obviously went to war with the monarchy and with Harry's family, which is a big and very difficult decision to take. But they then did it again and again and again. And when they first did that Oprah Winfrey interview in March 2021, the pitch was really clear. We were all told that they weren't taking a profit from that particular interview. Harry did another thing with the Me You Can't See documentary, with Oprah, with Harper Productions, the same production company at the same time. And we weren't actually told that in relation to the to the Apple TV show. So it could be that some of the kind of payment that they got was channeled through that other project. But needless to say, we were told the Oprah Winfrey interview, they were not getting paid for it. They were not making a profit from it. So then they did the Me You Can't See, and then they did a podcast. This was in May, right after Prince Philip died, a podcast called The Armchair Expert, in which Harry, went after his family again, made further criticisms, and then it bubbled away for a while, and then Netflix came out at the tail end of 2022, right after the Queen died, and that obviously it was a rerun of Oprah, and it just really felt like they were now kind of hammering the nail a little too many times, and it felt then, we know that they did turn a profit from Netflix, and the sums for $100 million for the contract was always said to be a little bit too high, but they clearly got a fair bit of cash out of it, let's be honest. And then Harry's book came out January 2023, and we know that he made millions from that too. So in other words, they did make millions trashing Harry's family. You might think that they were right to trash Harry's family. Perfectly legitimate opinion if that's your view. I'm not telling anybody what to think, but they did make substantial amount of money out of doing it. And so to go back to what those young people told the market research that Archewell Foundation conducted, they said that influencers are performative, inauthentic, and profit motivated. And so people are started from a point where they actually did believe Harry and Meghan were authentic. They believed the things that Harry and Meghan said. Then Oprah came out. Then they kind of partially tried to row back some of the Oprah claims. So Harry, for example, said that Meghan had never accused the royal family of racism. And people found that incredibly difficult to believe because everybody read Meghan's comments as an allegation of racism. And Harry and Meghan did nothing to correct that for about 18 months. So, in other words, they lost their authenticity. They had it and then they lost it, and now they're trying to get it back. That's the trajectory. And so the way you get that back, something that you no longer have, something that you lost through your own actions, it's a long, hard, uphill slog, and it doesn't come from being announced when you walk into an empty house, and it doesn't come from having a photorealistic image of your face printed on the foam of a cappuccino. And I don't obviously know exactly where the artistic direction for the photo shoot came from. Who knows? Maybe it wasn't from Meghan. But they probably should take away from this that they do just need to cool it a little bit with Diana, because maybe they, or Meghan at the very least, needs to cool it a little bit with Diana, because, at the end of the day, she never met Diana. And she's also done the same thing with Queen Elizabeth II. They have both really tried to hammer home this idea that the Queen loves Meghan, Meghan loves the Queen, everything was great with the Queen and Meghan, it was just the rest of the family that was the problem. And it was slightly difficult and uncomfortable because everybody knows that if the Queen didn't agree, there is nothing she would be able to say to convey that to the public without causing a massive, bin fire that would damage the monarchy. So it's something that they do a little bit, and they need to be very careful about it. But the underlying question obviously remains: what should they be doing? If there are some problems with the messaging at the moment, namely, don't just tell people you're authentic, you have to show them. And authenticity comes from not leaning really hard into being part of the 1%. But the other thing is, what do you do instead? So what they should be doing is hands-on charity work on the ground. And, in Meghan's defense, I think she did try to get a little bit of that into this Harper's Bazaar cover interview, because, there was this whole section where the journalist was brought to, I think it was like a museum or a gallery, to meet these girls who were going to see who were visiting this attraction, and she had a chat with them seemingly, but there was just so little about it in the copy. It seemed almost as though the journalist didn't totally know why that had happened or why she was brought along to it. There was nothing conveyed to kind of give us a clear idea of whether the girls really cared that they'd met Meghan, or whether they liked her. Like, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But if that was an old school royal engagement, there'd be quotes from some of the girls. There would be like a few snippets of what Meghan said to them. You'd try to convey a general sense of like the atmosphere in the room, but also the purpose behind the whole thing. And it's just all a little too vague and flat and didn't really land. And I think a lot of the charity work that is happening through Archewell falls into the same kind of category, possibly with the exception of the parent network. But, just going through their website, there's stuff there about food insecurity, but like, what have Harry and Meghan been doing on the ground about it? The royals, this is the difficult thing for them. They're constantly going to be compared to the royals and to William and Kate. And William and Kate and the royal family, William and Kate get accused of being lazy even when they're turning out once a week to do these charity jobs. And Harry and Meghan are going to be compared to that. And they're doing stuff like a few times a year. So they're doing way, way less than the working royals. But they're going to be compared using the same benchmark. And people don't really have a proper fixed idea in their minds of the fact that the royals do this charity work, partly because it's their full-time job. Charity work for most ordinary people is something you do on the weekend or outside of your working hours, unless you literally are an employee at the charity. If you're a volunteer, it's outside of your work. And I don't think there's any understanding or expectation from the public that, the charity work would simply stop once you have a different full-time job. I think, the public think volunteering is volunteering. And if you have a full-time job, you should still be volunteering in your spare time on your weekend. So the way that you rebuild authenticity is not to do the really high-profile charity events that Harry and Meghan have sometimes done in the past, your wildfires and, mass shooting incidents, which are incredibly tragic. And I do actually think it was good that Harry and Meghan tried to help, I think, in Texas. But the whole idea of royalty is that the royals bring the spotlight to a cause that isn't getting enough attention. And if Harry and Meghan wait until the spotlight falls on a cause and then try to jump into the middle of the spotlight, then that's the wrong way round. And people will read that as inauthentic. It has to be like a standard Sunday, in a forgettable, missable warehouse, outside LA, packaging food parcels for kids who have had their food stamps taken away, and like that. I think a lot of what Meghan has tried to do is still geared towards the logic of the social justice era. It's about feminism and women's rights, which are great. Absolutely no problem with those, with that as a cause. But there also needs to be some understanding that we've shifted out of one social era and cultural era and into another. And the current social cultural era is defined by high inflation and a really widening gap between rich and poor. And, Harry and Meghan are on the side of the 1%. They are millionaires. They crashed out of the monarchy, and their ordinary lives that they built on the other side are the lives of millionaires living in a massive mansion in Montecito. And so they need to have some awareness of that. And the authenticity is going to come from giving up their free time to help people who are in need. And, I like some of what they're doing, particularly the Parents Network, but I think they could really do with focusing that food insecurity issue is one that they could do a lot more on the ground, in forgettable places, helping people who are really, really struggling. And I think that would go a long, long way to rebuilding some of that authenticity that they clearly realize is the key to the modern world. And one thing I would just end on, I think, is that actually the crazy thing about it is that Harry and Meghan were so much the royals of the social justice era, and it was like the perfect moment for Meghan to walk into the royal family at the absolute height of that era. But actually, in the long march of history, if you want to talk about authenticity, actually William and Kate do scan as authentic. Like if you leave aside the kind of royal bombshells and the royal soap opera and the kind of internecine family arguments, they charge against William and Kate is that they're boring. Like this sometimes does get said in the British press, like they are the kind of vanilla long game royals who, are focused on the 10, 20-year plan, not like kind of capturing attention in the moment. But actually, they're authentic. Like people, they scan as authentic. When they're in the room with people, they read as entirely themselves. And if William had found himself in a position where he'd walked into a room and his presence had been announced to an empty house, he would have tried to make a joke about it and puncture he would have been aware, I think, of the absurdity of it and would probably have tried to make light of it. And I think Harry and Meghan could do with maybe understanding that the more you push, the more you drive at something, the less authentic you seem, because that is the charge that those young people leveled at influencers, is that they're grifters who are motivated by profit, are trying too hard to get something. And that's the luxury of monarchy. William and Kate don't need to try hard, and they're not chasing a profit because they're not allowed to. And that enables them to come across as more authentic. Now, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor told a former palace press secretary back in 2011 that he had asked an on-duty Metropolitan Police officer to basically effectively dig up dirt on his accuser, Virginia Giuffre. Now, the police are reviewing those reports in newspapers. That's slightly different to an investigation. They haven't formally launched an investigation yet, but they're reviewing the material available to decide whether to open a new investigation into Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, which, if happened, it's hypothetically possible, it could lead to him winding up in court after all. But not probably on the basis of Virginia Giuffre's actual allegations against him that she was trafficked as a 17-year-old Jeffrey Epstein victim to have sex with him in London, New York, and the US Virgin Islands in 2001. Andrew, of course, denies those allegations. He sued Virginia Virginia sued him back in 2021. He settled out of court in 2022 for an undisclosed sum, said to be in the millions, but while denying liability. So that's the background. But essentially what happened was, as the House Oversight Committee has been making all of these emails published, one email in particular got leaked to a British newspaper, the Mail, on Sunday, and in it, Andrew said this: it would seem she, as in Virginia, has a criminal record in the States. I have given her DOB, i.e. date of birth, and social security number for investigation with, redacted, the name of the police officer. And he says that's the on-duty PPO as in police protection officer. So a source has told The Sun that as part of the initial examination of the case, officers are trying to establish what material is available. They are actively seeking to find emails and communications from Andrew's royalty protection team, as well as their notebooks. So that is reassuring to see that work is being done, that something is actually happening on that case. And of course, the implications for the monarchy are that if that does get reopened, if Andrew winds up in court, then that could be massive. I mean, it could go either way. Like, it really could. I'm completely on the fence. It could either be devastating to the monarchy because people will think you shielded this guy for so long, if indeed he is convicted, or if there's an attempt to prosecute Andrew and he's acquitted, what does that mean for faith in the criminal justice system? And what does it mean for the monarchy? But also, actually, if Andrew were to be hauled into court, he would, I'm sure, protest his innocence. It would likely not be on sex trafficking charges. It would likely be for an offence called misconduct in a public office, or potentially conspiracy to commit misconduct in a public office. Much lesser offence. It would be a much lesser time in jail. But if he was convicted, and if the monarchy had supplied evidence, emails, maybe even testimony to the case, then it could actually help the monarchy's reputation, because it could be an opportunity for the palace to show that they're not shielding Andrew from justice, because that has always been the most damaging part for the palace. So obviously the most damaging part for Andrew is the central allegation that Virginia was trafficked and forced to have sex with him and feared for her life if she refused, and by Epstein and Maxwell. It's not clear whether any prosecution will happen. It might well not. But interestingly, the law in this area has actually been fine-tuned recently. There was a point when it was actually very vague, but then a whole load of prosecutions were brought against journalists, and those journalists wound up being acquitted, often through appeals to the High Court. So there's a lot of there's a body of case law from High Court judges who ruled on high-profile cases about misconduct in a public office. So there's a much greater understanding now in the police and the Crown Prosecution Service about what that offence is. Now, the worst case scenario for the monarchy is probably that a police officer gets prosecuted and Andrew doesn't. And under those circumstances, irrespective of whether that police officer were convicted or acquitted, it would be devastating to the reputation of the monarchy, because it would look like basically the establishment was still protecting Andrew as a member of the royal family, but throwing a rank-and-file police officer under the bus in order to do so. So it's going to be really interesting to see what side of the fence the Crown Prosecution Service fall on. It will likely be their decision. If there is an investigation, it will be a Crown Prosecution Service, which is like, for American listeners, it's the equivalent of kind of the district attorney or the US attorney. It's the prosecuting authority. So, whereas in the American press they refer to the government as the prosecution, in Britain we it's the CPS. So it would be their decision if a charge is brought, or the police may decide to just not investigate it, in which case potential reputational damage for the police and for the monarchy, because again, it looks like an establishment cover-up. And the big question will be, if the police are going through the emails of police officers, do they have access to Andrew's emails? Have the palace provided the police with access to Andrew's emails? If they have, not only have we not been told about that at all, but we haven't been told how it was done, because that's a complicated and difficult task. Ordinarily, an institution in a similar position would call in outside legal counsel to review emails and decide which ones needed to be handed over to the police and which ones not, in order to wash their hands of the moral responsibility for doing it. And we have certainly not been told that that has happened in this case. So if no investigation materializes, and the palace didn't cooperate, it didn't help the police to kind of review material, then there could be really serious consequences for the reputation of the monarchy. Also, interestingly, my understanding is the press officer involved who was emailed has absolutely no recollection of this happening. So it may well be that the police officers too, it happened so long ago at a time that was so frenzied and busy that they also cannot remember what, if anything, was done after Andrew made this request. And Andrew was he's a very overbearing, strong personality who might well have told a police officer to do any number of things. It doesn't necessarily mean any of those police officers did it. So that is the other aspect here. But whatever happens, there's going to be a big decision for the police and for the Crown Prosecution Service to decide which way to jump. Now, the king is at a key moment in his reign, which is that he's had drama from Andrew recently. He had the kind of the grief of succession, and then he had the kind of joy and celebration of the coronation. And now, over the next kind of year, he's going to have an opportunity to focus on legacy. And one of his big projects that he's going to be focusing on is the King's Trust and the King's Trust International. Now, KTI, the King's Trust International, is the kind of global arm of this youth charity, youth opportunity charity, which forms one of the biggest planks of what Charles has done over the course of his whole career. And that's the first anniversary coming up. So that is November 27th, which is Thursday this week. If you're watching the YouTube show, it might have already happened. But that's going to be a big moment for Charles because it's 10 years since he took this project global. And then next year is the 50th anniversary of the King's Trust, the original charity, which was UK-based, and he's got a Netflix crew who are going to be following him around, recording a documentary about it, and there's going to be loads of events celebrating that throughout 2026. And so what's so important about it is it was the moment that Charles basically reshaped the concept of monarchy, at least for the royals who come after the monarch. So it was always pretty clear what the king or queen was supposed to be doing, but for the Prince of Wales, for the next in line to the throne, there was no actual definition of that role, no kind of written down blueprint of what the heir to the throne should do. And so he'd served time in the Royal Navy, then he came out of the military, and he used his severance pay as £7,400. It was probably worth a little bit more then than it is now, but he used that to create this charity. And essentially what happened was he didn't know what he was going to do with his life. And there were, ideas about sending him off to be governor of Australia, or, the Labour Callaghan government in power at the time wanted him to be ambassador to France, which would have been crazy, but that was one idea that was kicked around. And instead, Charles decided that he was going to create a charity to help ordinary people struggling with the same basic question of what to do with their lives. And so that £7,400 severance pay was used to create grants to help young people start up businesses, people who from working class families who might not have had their kind of credit rating to get loans from the bank, who got some seed funding to kind of start them off on, business ideas, or then they moved into kind of educational programs and training. And then they moved into kind of funding internships, all aimed at basically getting kids from, the wrong side of the track. They're sometimes referred to in governance, local governance and, national government spaces, and NEETs people, not in education, employment or training, but young kids who basically need to find a sense of purpose and direction in life to establish themselves and get into a career. And this has been one of Charles's biggest things, alongside his work on the environment, which falls under a slightly different category. That's his kind of focus and passion for the idea of harmony. But this is the other big thing Charles has done, and it is, for me, probably the kind of, not to labour the metaphor, but it's the crowning cause of his reign, really. Because, when you meet somebody who's been helped by the King's Trust, it really shows in their attitude to it that, having somebody, I think as much as anything else, it's having somebody believe that you can be a success and place that faith in you is hugely important to those young people who have often, they've often had like real hardship in their lives beyond economic circumstance. There was one very moving story at the King's Trust Awards in the summer of a kid, I think it was his brother, if I recall correctly, who passed away. And, that made him want to give up on an opportunity he'd been given, but he saw it through, and now he's building a career in the media. So KTI, took it all international, and so Charles is, this charity is now going around running these projects, helping people in really dire circumstances all around the world, including, child brides and, women who have, from like early teens, 12, 13 years old with kids. And, there are really upsetting stories, but also, it has given an opportunity to those people. So let's talk a little bit. I did a big feature on all of this for Newsweek's magazine, which you can, if you go out and buy a copy, you can read all about it. But I'll just give you a little bit of the detail. So I spoke to an aide to the king to just find out a little bit about what it means to Charles. And the aide told me the establishment thought it, i.e. creating the original King's Trust, was a risky thing for him to be doing. This is back in the 70s. Because a royal's role was to travel around places, smiling, waving, snipping ribbons, becoming ambassadors to far-flung places. And that's what their role was, not to get actively involved in trying to engage in social action through their own organisations, with their own name above the door. So you understand the distinction there. So if you jump on a charity that already exists and you shine a spotlight on that charity, you are helping and you're giving back, but you're not taking on any of the kind of reputational risk of trying to make that project successful. So what Charles was trying to do is create his own charity, his own project in his name, and take on all the kind of reputational risks associated with that. So the aide told me, there were those within the palace at the time who thought that was not a great idea to be involved in a social purpose vehicle like that because it could go wrong. Or if it did go wrong, what are the financial risks around it? What he was determined to do it anyway, and from that small seed has grown an organisation of immense scale and impact globally and nationally that is used as a best practice model for youth opportunity around the world. It's a sense of enormous pride to him. And, the key thing for me is the way that this did shape the direction that the royals went in beyond Charles. And actually, you kind of step back from it, it probably kind of helped shape Diana a little bit too in ways. Charles had already ripped that plaster off in terms of moving into kind of social action and slightly more political causes that chimed with, aspects of the politics of the era, because the 70s was an era of economic hardship. There was a stock market crash around that time. There was also something called the Winter of Discontent in Britain in the late 70s, which was, a period when they brought in like the 4-day week. It was a period of huge economic hardship for people. And so to help the kind of, not to labour the point, but the dispossessed it had a political dimension to it, which I think is probably what concerned some people in the palace on the Queen's staff. But, it has changed the course of history, and the aide told me it certainly set out a template that he was going to be an active and socially engaged Prince of Wales. It certainly seems to have been something of a template for the new Prince of Wales, i.e. William, in terms of his social purpose action that he's doing with Homewards being William's homelessness project. So this is basically what the King's Trust means in terms of the actual kind of long-term story of the monarchy. It was how Charles shaped what generations to come would be like. And so when you hear William talking, as he often does, about wanting to change the monarchy and to push for impact, what he's doing there is, in fact, a continuation of the legacy that Charles has created. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with William wanting to take it further, but I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that Charles did actually start the monarchy down that path, having those difficult arguments with the Queen's aides who didn't want to do it, paving the way for William to then come along and simply try to go further in the same direction as his father. But I just want to end with one final point, which is just to read a little bit of one of the stories that... I'll tell you what, I'll do two things. So I had a chat with a man called Will Straw, who's the chief executive of the King's Trust International, and he told me this really heartwarming story about a woman called Artie who was helped by the charity. And so this is what he told me. Artie was in an arranged marriage and indeed an abusive marriage. She had a daughter when she was just 13 years old, and when she was about 17 or 18, she heard about our Project The Heart Women's Economic Empowerment Program, which we run with the Aga Khan Foundation in India. So, by this point, Artie's marriage had collapsed, it had ended, and she went home to live with her parents, and she had this daughter to raise, but she had few economic opportunities, basically. This is in Uttar Pradesh in India, which is where they lived. So what the trust did was they helped her to establish herself as a female rickshaw driver, which was, not a hugely easy thing to do because it was a very male-dominated profession, and the other drivers were, kind kind of sexist towards her, basically, when she was trying to get set up. But the scheme helped, they basically put her in touch with the scheme to recruit women drivers who went to pick up female passengers from late night shifts, and often those women were victims of sexual abuse themselves and sexual harassment. So it was, a kind of nice virtuous circle where she was able to help people who had been in kind of similar positions, I suppose, to the one that she was in. And that was a successful project. And Artie won the Amal Clooney Women's Empowerment Award in 2024, and they brought her over to Britain, and they took her to the palace, and they brought her in. They created a replica of her pink rickshaw that she drives around in India, and they brought her into the palace in one of them, basically. So that's a nice moment. And then there was also a woman called Arushetu, 28, and she was expelled from her school after she became pregnant. It's a really sad story. So again, she had to leave her daughter with her mother, and I get a strong sense of the disruption that pregnancy brings into people's lives when they're in situations of economic uncertainty, because obviously they got to get work in order to pay for their child, but also they have a child to raise, to bring up. So she left her daughter with her mother, and she went into the city to try to find work, and wound up being homeless before she then encountered a King's Trust International program, which helped her to get a job on reception at a guest house. And this is what she told Newsweek. I want to be living proof that it is possible to rise above one's circumstances and achieve success. Whenever I meet the old friends I used to sleep on the veranda with, I tell them about opportunities like the Get Into program, which can transform their lives like it did mine. So, this is the point. This is what it's all about. And obviously, in a world with 8 billion people in it, it's hard to help, the whole of planet Earth. But there are ways that people can help a small number of people and really, make a huge difference in the process. And that's it for this week's episode of The Royal Report. Be sure to join me every week when I visit the latest royal headlines, embark on some royal deep dives, and riff on all things royal. Until next time, I'm Jack Royston. Thank you for joining, and a curtsy to you all.